I'm delighted to welcome Julian Albilla from the University of Southern California and Ian Christie from the University of Birkbeck, who will be discussing the ever-present question of terrorism, not in relation to military intervention, but in relation to the films of Louis Buñuel. Buñuel was making films long before the advent of so-called international terrorism in the 1960s. But in the late films, such as The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, as you will have just seen, the figure of the terrorist appears explicitly. Ian, would you like to begin, perhaps, by telling us more about the historical contexts behind the representation of terrorism in The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie?
I'll try. I'm not sure how much sort of ambient knowledge of Buñuel people bring to seeing this film. My sense is that familiarity with the whole sweep of Buñuel's career has kind of receded a little bit. So it might just be worth remembering that this film that you've just seen belongs to a group of late films which he made having come back to Europe, as it were, and having found a wonderful producer in the shape of Serge Silberman, who was able to put together the kind of films that Buñuel felt he wanted to make at this stage in his career, which are, in a sense, black comedies. And they're picaresque films in which characters stroll through a landscape in which they're violently interrupted by random events. In some ways, the model for this is an extraordinary film he made called La Voie lactée, the Milky Way, which is a stroll through the history of heresy. I remember writing a review of this when it first came out, and I became an instant expert on heresies in the early Catholic Church, because you had to know your heresies. And for Buñuel, that history of heresy erupting within the church, the Catholic Church, is like a model for the eruption of the irrational as it meets the certainty of those who believe they know the truth. And in his memoir, called My Last Breath, Buñuel talks about this group of films and talks about this sense that he had that unites them, that they're all about figures who believe they know the truth, and other figures who they challenge. And he sees this as something which has been going throughout history. It's got a very, very long history as far as he's concerned. And what he's showing us in these later films is a kind of modern manifestation of something which we can track back through his career, of course, his career in Mexico, and even back to his career as the prototype surrealist filmmaker. And just one more thing to mention. Buñuel, as I'm sure most of you know, began his career as the man who made the first definitive surrealist film, Un Chien Andalou, the Andalusian dog, back in 1929. And it was a film which the surrealists embraced. They hadn't got any surrealist films at this point, and as soon as they saw Un Chien Andalou, they embraced Buñuel and Dali as the two young artists who had given them exactly the film they needed. Now, the important thing to say about Un Chien Andalou, which is really the start of Buñuel's career, obviously, is that it's a film full of the same irrational, random, unpredictable violence. It all happens in 20 minutes, but it's got a very, very similar pattern to the film we've just seen. Characters are suddenly interrupted by the most absurd and the most atrocious things happening to them. So in a sense, he started as he continued and as he ended. And he once described Un Chien Andalou as a call to murder. Strange thing to say about the film. He claimed there was a riot at the first screening of the film. We now know there wasn't a riot. But it suited Buñuel's purposes very well to maintain the myth that there was a riot. And he also quoted, of course, what the founder of surrealism, André Breton, had said. André Breton said in I think it was the second Surrealist Manifesto, not the first, he said, the simplest surrealist act would be to go out into the street and shoot at random. Now, I think what Buñuel kind of confronts us with, even in these late, rather comedic films, is just how seriously are we going to take the surrealist challenge to the civilized, the everyday, the urbane. Because for surrealists in the 1920s, it was a matter of life and death in many ways. They didn't go out into the street and shoot people, but they encouraged other people to, and they put violent acts of the irrational on a pedestal and said, these are authentic surrealist acts. And here we are, at this late stage. Buñuel is an old man. He's still inviting us to consider just how tolerant are we prepared to be, how seriously are we prepared to take the demands of the irrational, the eruption of what we see in these late films.
Thank you, Ian. Julian, I'll hand over to you, and maybe you can sort of also add your thoughts on the contexts behind terrorism in Buñuel.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in London, and as you can see, I have an accent which relates to something I want to say about the film and the sound. I'd like to say that three things that I'm thinking about listening to Ian. It seems to me that this idea of the cultural terrorist that is so celebrated in the 1920s, it changes in a way in the 1930s with the rise of fascism. And Breton, in a way, it becomes very skeptical about that sentence. So is Buñuel, and of course, as you may know, they are extremely concerned, Breton, especially with Dali's titillation with fascism. And so I think, and Buñuel does say that perhaps, he says imagination is free, man is not, man isn't. But he does say, okay, I'm a cultural terrorist. I place bombs. Unlike Fassbinder, who says, I don't place bombs, I make films. But Buñuel says, I'm a cultural terrorist, but it takes place in my imagination. We know that Freud, says that the unconscious doesn't distinguish between, fact and thought. So in a way, so that I will say that about surrealism's, celebration of the irrational, but it seems to me that it's always we cannot think about the irrational of surrealism, but the way in which they point to the irrationality of the social and of the bourgeois social and symbolic order. So when we think about Breton's Nadja, the book, which obviously it's here, it is reflected in this book, it's obviously in this film, it is obviously reflected in that obscure object of desire. It's always, the irrationality. It has to do with, with some kind of pointing to a lack in the way in which we can. I'm using Zizek in the way in which our ideology is a fantasy and is always, an incomplete narrative, and that's what when we encounter that rupture. It's actually constitutive of our social and symbolic order. Now, in relation to your question, Eleanor, it seems to me that Buñuel is very much concerned and preoccupied with international terrorism. In this context, in the 70s, we already have in Spain, although he never comes back to Spain after, when he goes into exile after the Spanish Civil War. So he lives in Mexico. He makes the films in France, but he remains, a citizen of Mexico, and so he's going to be always concerned with the legacies of fascism in Spain as well as globally, and obviously also in Latin America. He's very prophetic because although we have this imaginary country, it kind of anticipates what is going to take place in Chile and Argentina, like 2 years afterwards. Or 4 years in the case of Argentina. So, but also in the context of Europe, it seems to me that he is very much also, preoccupied with the fact that the terrorism that is taking place in Europe at that time, whether in Italy or Germany, these are the children of the fascists. So these are the bourgeois. subjects, who rebel against, what their parents did, because that, as you know, once Germany is completely integrated into the Western, capitalist system, after the Second World War, there is not much discussion of the Holocaust until much later, when we have the discourse of the Holocaust. So it seems to me that this is important, and Buñuel does say, the terrorist is someone who appears like a bourgeois subject, is not someone who is alienated. So it's interesting that we have these three films, but there is something very important that he mentions in his autobiography, which is the script of a film that he never makes in 1979, which is called Agony. He says that agony is the fight that we know for sure that we're going to lose. And this film is, he does say that he's very concerned, and this is why Buñuel is so prophetic, because he's very concerned with overpopulation, with information, and with the hegemony of science and technology. So he's extremely already, extremely concerned with, biopolitics, and so in this script, Agon, as I said, is the film that he never makes. It's the film, if you like, the film to come, right? So there's never closure in the case of Buñuel, because of this film is very much it's a film about planting a bomb next to the Louvre Museum by radical left, the terrorists, and yet the bomb is fabricated in an embassy of a Middle Eastern country or Africa, and the intermediary is the army. So as you can see, it's something that that is incredible how we can think of the terrorist subplot in these films, and the way in which he is anticipating, a lot of our current issues. Can I say something else about sound? And that's why I'm saying, that it relates to me. As you noticed, it was fascinating the way in which, you had this sound, this menacing sound, this sound that is irreducible, right? It's an irreducible alterity, and that it is, impregnates, the filmic space, and yet it cannot be integrated. And this points to that irrationality, and this is the way in which nowadays, relegate, the terrorists to the irrational space. In France, for instance, ISIS is not translated into, this is Judith Butler in an article, it's not translated into French precisely because they want to keep that kind of alterity of terrorism. As I'm sure you know, that in the Paris attacks, something that they said is, they spoke French with French accent. You see what I mean? So there is this idea of the sound and the policing of sound, which relates back to the colonias, to the colonial legacy, what Fanon says, in the case of France, of policing, sound. So it seems to me that Buñuel is really, we can also read, from our current, perspective, read, Buñuel.
Thank you. That's really interesting, especially in relation to the fact that in the Discreet Charm, of course, you have all those moments where communication is interrupted, and we have important phone calls. You get the sound of jet planes overhead, which obscure this communication, prevent the audience from hearing, although the subtitles help us, I guess, what exactly is going on. If we could return briefly, perhaps, partly because I'm intrigued by it, to those moments of terrorist violence in the Discreet Charm. They appear to be somewhat marginal to the action. But is this the case? Are they as marginal and as random as they appear?
Well, Buñuel actually says in My Last Breath, and the tone of it is very interesting. He says, by the way, one of these films, The Phantom of Liberty, did actually provoke a bomb outrage in a cinema in San Francisco. A group planted a bomb in the cinema, and he sort of recounts that the tone of it is interesting because he offers it as a kind of example of how what is treated often in a seemingly almost casual way, as you say, actually, of course, has a correlate in the real world. I mean, he's very conscious of this. As you rightly said, he came through an era, he came out of an era in France when there were lots of outrages. I mean, what we call terrorism today was, in fact, an everyday occurrence in France for all sorts of reasons. He lived through the period of the Spanish Civil War, and he lived in Mexico. He was close to aspects of violence, and he came back to Franco's Spain. He was constantly aware of violence around him throughout his entire life, so he knew much more about it than most of us do, which I think is really your point. And yet the tone in Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie is almost comic opera. The terrorists come in with their guns, and they, it ends with a joke. The man from Miranda who can't bear to leave the well-cooked lamb and pays the price for it. It is a joke. Buñuel is determined not to fall into the position of kind of false seriousness, because his tone, his stance is defiantly surrealist. He maintained that he was a surrealist to the end of his days, and he's interested in showing fanaticism with a detached perspective, not falling into the trap of taking it seriously, but saying, well, yes, of course it happens. It's all around us. We are constantly at the mercy of the unpredictable, the irrational, the eruption of violence in our best behaved situations. And I think that's a very interesting lesson as we try inevitably to apply it to the world that we're living in today.
Yeah, Julian, I was also wondering about the figure of this terrorist in the Discreet Charm being, first of all, Latin American, but secondly, a woman, and the significance of this in relation to what you were saying about the terrorist as the figure of the other.
So basically, it seems to me that Buñuel, by the 60s and the 70s, I mean, he does go to Spain twice. He makes both Viridiana and Tristana, which is the adaptation of Galdós. And Viridiana, as you know, is actually interesting because when it came out, I mean, it was kind of forbidden and then managed to get to the Cannes Film Festival. But there was this caricature that Buñuel arrives in Spain and plants this bomb, actually, so the film. But Buñuel, what is interesting is that at this by the 70s, I don't think he believes in the grand narratives. I don't think he believes he's completely disappointed with with May '68, with the students, with May '68, with the student revolution, failed revolution, but he's completely disappointed with Marxism. I mean, he always, although he obviously belonged to the Communist Party, but then he doesn't think that Marxism. I mean, he always remains an anarchist and nihilist, and he does identify himself as an anarchist and nihilist, however ambivalently. But it seems to me that neither Marxism nor surrealism provide the solutions or the answers to the complexity of the human condition or our animal condition, which in Buñuel, it's interesting that this film has to be understood in relation to, I hope you can see it, The Exterminating Angel, which takes place in Mexico, but he did say that I wish he had shot that film here in London or Paris, with proper bourgeois, subjects. But it seems to me that so the grand narratives are in crisis, and Buñuel is conscious of this, and with surrealism. So it seems to me that this idea of the subversion of surrealism, or this emphasis on desire as a kind of liberation of bourgeois consciousness, and therefore the potentiality of transforming reality, it fails. And Buñuel does say that it's a failure. Terrorism is a failure. However, so basically, I'm just trying to say this to answer your question, because it seems to me that there is a wonderful sentence here when he says you are more suitable to make love than the war. This is obviously ironic, and this is precisely mocking that slogan of love yes and war no, right? Actually, the film, the Agon, his last film, which was never made, it was going to be called War Yes, Neither Love. So it was a kind of mocking that slogan. But it seems to me that it's interesting that if we think about the psychic and the political, that in relation to the question of gender and sexual difference, that we can think about that imbrication of the micro and the macro political, and the way in which it is always this threat. Okay, it is this threat to the patriarchal bourgeois, heteronormative Western subjectivity. However, that threat is not a rupture. It doesn't lead to a complete rupture. It is actually constitutive, and in a way, and it fits actually that system. You see what I mean? So the perversion is not, kind of transgression from the norm, but it actually is constitutive of the norm.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we have, I suppose, kind of drawing from what you're both saying, is this extraordinary depiction of terrorism, which, although it seems in some ways to stand in great contrast to the bourgeois dinner parties that we witness, in fact, it is closer to them and more interrelated than we might first perceive. We also have that wonderful moment when the ambassador says to the terrorist that he has just disarmed, "Violence leads nowhere," which is, I suppose, another mocking Buñuel moment. I was going to ask you about a comment that the critic William Rothman made about Buñuel. He and I've got a quote for you here. He wrote that in Buñuel's art, what is principled and what is perverse cannot be separated. Buñuel is a moralist, and he is also a terrorist. This seems to go back perhaps to the questions of heresy that you were talking about at the beginning, Ian, this mixture of principle and perversion or violence. What do you make of this assertion, Buñuel as a moral terrorist?
Well, I mean, it's there right from the start. I mean, it's the film that I guess is least known of Buñuel's, which it seems to me is a very, very important film in terms of just establishing what he's about. It's not Un Chien Andalou, that was his debut. It's L'Âge d'Or, the film that he made afterwards, a longer film, made with Salvador Dali. And that's a film which is literally the prototype for Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, because it's about a kind of bourgeois ritual which is constantly interrupted by much more outrageous things than we see even in the Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. It was a shocking film. It was immediately banned. It remained banned for a long time. It has never been easy to see, in fact, although it's, of course, one can see it now more easily, but for many, many years it was spoken of as a kind of terrorist film, a film that, really was too shocking, too extreme, too lacking in any sense of propriety to be allowed to be seen. And that, I think, is really where Buñuel is coming from, because what he then did was to go off, when he was forced into exile, he went to America, worked at the Museum of Modern Art, and was forced to leave America by being denounced as a communist, took refuge in Mexico, which, as you rightly said, when he made The Exterminating Angel, he never thought Mexico was so wonderful. He said it would have been a much more powerful film if it had been made in one of the centers of civilization, because there would have been some force to it. But what he did in Mexico was to build up this extraordinary canon of transgressive films, which are transgressive in small ways or in seemingly almost marginal and playful ways, but he never loses sight of the need to be transgressive and to throw a little bomb at the audience. But when he can, of course, he hits the audience harder And this is why this film is so important, because it is meant to make us think that we are the people on screen. I mean, clearly, if we just put it in context of the place, these are some of the most famous stars of French cinema. And I think that moment when one of the dreams has them appearing on stage, one of their dinner parties is taking place on stage, I think that the significance of that is that we realize that we are those people, as it were, in the cinema. You could just as easily stage that scene where the camera turns around and shows us sitting there on display, as it were, all our complacency and all our assumption that we know how to behave and so forth. So I think the charge behind the film is, although discreet, is just as great as it was in L'Âge d'Or.
Wonderful. We've just got a few more minutes, so I'll hand over to Julian to say a couple more words, perhaps, about that incredible assertion. Of course, I'm wary of the metaphorical use of the term terrorist here.
I just want to say that actually this film won the Academy Award. And actually, it's interesting because that year, that year, Spain presented a wonderful film, which is the first film during Franco, Spain, that is portrays a transsexual, transgender subject. Joe Evans knows very well. This film is called My Dearest Señorita, but it actually that film lost to the Discreet Charm de la Bourgeoisie. I will say, I don't know that critic, but I would say that's a reductive way of thinking about Buñuel. I want to think that I want to think of Buñuel in a much more, a kind of productive ambivalence. And it seems to me that I want to stay with this image of the road, that goes nowhere, because it does encapsulate, what I think about Buñuel, which is about that, as you're saying, there is a bomb, but there is never a resistance to a kind of spectacularization of violence. So it's always, keeping us, critically thinking about, the society. And it seems to me that in some ways, it seems to me that whether he's a nihilist, whether he's an anarchist, that there is a possibility, and using Rancière, that, when we encounter his films, there is always the possibility, precisely because of their unpredictability, that we may or may not become emancipated. Therefore, use the Rancière sentence of the emancipated spectator. So it seems to me that I'm not sure if that answers your question.
That sounds like an excellent note on which to bring this to a close. Thank you very much, Ian and Julian. Thank you.